Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Friedman, president of the Greater Houston chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Texas and this country are facing so many challenges today. And some of the issues that are facing us are ones that we thought were behind us, or that at least we had made progress on. It's unfortunate, though, that our society is so divided these days, and some are so angry that it seems nearly impossible to resolve some of them. One principle that all Americans should be able to agree on and unite behind is religious freedom. This foundational American principle protects everyone's right to believe in the freedom of the religion of their choice or no religion, as long as they don't harm others. And this fundamental right to be treated equally under the law depends on the separation of church and state. Yet religious extremists and their allies, their lawmaker allies particularly, prefer a nation where the beliefs of a narrow minority of Christian nationalists prevail. And in the name of religion, they are using the law to force everyone else to abide by, to live by their beliefs. And that divides us, divides our communities and our country. Many people don't realize how pervasive this movement is, how religious doctrine is connected to so many social issues, and how many people are harmed by this. Women, people of color, religious minorities, LGBTQ people, public school students and their parents, educators, those of us who fund public schools and don't want to fund religious schools. Did I leave anybody out? Probably not. Now that's what tonight's program is going to explore. We're pleased to have with us tonight 3 Houstonians, all community leaders, to address these issues. Rabbi Josh Fixler to talk about reproductive freedom, Brandon Mack to talk about LGBTQ equality, and Bishop John Ogletree, who will talk about racial justice. But first, we're pleased to have with us, and we're lucky to have with us, a member of AU's national staff. She is a lawyer, one of the fine lawyers that AU has in the legal department in Washington, D.C. I want to turn it over to her at this time to frame the issue. She's going to be facilitating the remarks of the panelists. So I turn it over to her now, Adrienne Spoto. Adrienne?
Hi. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nancy. And thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Church-state separation has never been a more timely topic than it is today. And it certainly seems like there's no more fitting place to discuss it than in Texas. As Nancy explained, we at Americans United work to bring together people of all religions and none to protect our fundamental right to be treated equally under the law. We fight in the courts, in the legislatures, and in the public square to prevent religious extremists from using their beliefs to harm others. And we believe that by doing this, it enables us all to be free to practice our own religions, to foster religious freedom for all, and enable us to come together as equals to build a stronger democracy. That strong separation of church and state will protect all of our rights, including the 3 particular right topics that we're talking about today. So I'd like to go ahead and get started on our first topic for the evening, reproductive freedom. At Americans United, we recognize that reproductive freedom is religious freedom. Laws restricting abortion, enabling employers to deprive employees of contraceptive coverage, all sorts of other restrictions on people's reproductive freedom have long been grounded in certain religious views. But we at AU know that people of faith from across many denominations and religious traditions see reproductive decision-making as an important part of their faith, and they don't believe that the government should be making those decisions for us. That's why we've been active in fighting for reproductive freedom across the country. We filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court supporting the challenge to Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban, arguing that protection of abortion rights in Roe versus Wade protects religious pluralism. We've also been active in supporting access to contraceptives under the Affordable Care Act, pushing back against efforts to provide expansive religious exemptions from that coverage. Here to speak with us more about the interconnection between reproductive freedom and religious freedom is Rabbi Joshua Fixler. Rabbi Fixler is Associate Rabbi at the Congregation Emmanuel in Houston. He serves as president of Faith Leaders Coalition of Greater Houston and he's a steering committee member for the Religious Action Center of Texas, as well as a member of the board of directors of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Rabbi Fixler grew up hearing the story of his grandmother's decision to have an abortion 70 years ago. He continues to share her story today. As a religious leader, he feels obliged to explain Jewish beliefs about abortion differ from those enshrined in abortion restrictions like those in Texas. Rabbi Fixler, could you tell us a little bit more about what draws you to this issue?
Absolutely. First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here and to be a part of this conversation tonight and to get to learn with all of you and discuss these really vital issues and frame them, I think, in an important way. So you mentioned my grandmother. Yesterday was my grandmother's 90th birthday. So we got to celebrate with her via video chat, and that was very special. And 70 years ago, in 1952, she was 20, and she had an unplanned pregnancy while her husband, my grandfather, was at finishing up his degree in college. A unplanned pregnancy, but one she would have wanted to keep. Until she was diagnosed with a life-threatening complication a few weeks into the pregnancy. There was a real challenge for her, potentially life-threatening. So there was a real challenge for her in terms of what she would decide to do. She remembers very vividly a doctor telling her, if you were my daughter, I would tell you to get this abortion, which provided for her a great amount of clarity. She had to travel across state lines to a place where abortion would be slightly more accessible. This is 1952, so we are before Roe v. Wade. And she was, the doctors at the hospital in Boston where she got this procedure listed her on her chart as having had a miscarriage so that they could perform the DNC. And so, and she was in those moments, she's told me she was afraid for her future ability to have children. She was afraid for what it might mean to do this in an environment where it was not legal, but she was not afraid that she was making the wrong decision. She was absolutely clear that she was making the right decision for her and her life. She had made that decision in consultation with doctors and her husband and with God, and she has told me on many an occasion that she has never once looked back on that decision with regret. And so I grew up hearing that story. I grew up as a third-generation activist for reproductive justice, and I grew up understanding that part of why we cared about this issue was about trying to make sure that we didn't return to a world like the world where my grandmother had to cross state lines and lie to medical professionals or have medical professionals lie on her behalf to receive life-saving care. But also, I was told that we did this work because it was a deep Jewish value. And I want to share with you a little bit tonight about why. And I will say it's very interesting and heartbreaking to be having this conversation with you on the eve of the Supreme Court decision that will come down in the coming weeks, we're told, and which all indications are that Roe v. Wade will be severely limited or overturned. And so the idea that we are on the cusp of returning to a world not unlike the one my grandmother experienced 70 years ago brings me great sadness. So I want to tell you just a little bit about how the Jewish tradition understands abortion, show you a little bit why that is different from how other faith traditions might understand abortion, and then make the case why that is a separation of church and state issue. And to do that, I'm going to share just a couple of slides. So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, or the Hebrew Bible, makes no reference of abortion. Anyone who tells you that the Bible talks about abortion maybe misunderstands what the Bible says. And I do want to show you the closest thing to that conversation, which comes from the book of Exodus in a Torah portion called Mishpatim. In that portion, we are given a scenario where 2 men are fighting, and one of them, in the process of fighting, strikes a nearby woman who is pregnant, and she has a miscarriage, but no other damage to her body ensues. In that scenario, the Torah tells us that we are responsible to pay a fine to the husband, because this is a patriarchal society, based on a certain value that would be ascribed to that potential life. Then it presents an alternative scenario. If other damage ensues, if her physical body is harmed in an additional way, then the punishment is what in Latin we call lex talionis, an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth, or a hand for a hand, and if she were to die, a life for life. This is the closest thing the Torah comes to saying anything that would relate to abortion. But what we can see from this text is that there seems to be a differential value placed on the potential life growing inside this pregnant person than her life, so that there is a fine paid if the potential life is lost, but the punishment is an eye for an eye for her life. And so all Jewish law that understands abortion uses this as a starting place. I will say as a note, and I can answer more questions about this in the Q&A time if you're interested, that some Christian texts understand this Exodus text differently based on a debate about the translation of the Bible into Greek, and particularly of the phrase "and no other damage ensues." But at least in terms of the traditional Jewish understanding of this text, it refers to this differential value between potential life and actualized life. So from this, we get a host of Jewish texts that actually do address abortion explicitly, including this text from the Mishnah, which comes from the 1st to the 3rd century. That's quite explicit. It probably needs a trigger warning. It says if a woman is having trouble giving birth and her life is threatened, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb from limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, if the baby has started to be delivered, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for another. I recognize that this text is graphic, and I think this text is intentionally graphic because it wants there to be no question as to what one should do. In the situation where a person's life is threatened, the precedence always goes to the life of the mother, of the realized life. And the actualized life, the potential life, while it has value, has a differential value. But once it has started to be born, it is a human being with co-equal rights. There are more texts in the Jewish tradition that are pertinent, but that is a whole 1-hour class just on its own. But I will say that there are ancient Jewish texts that describe a pregnancy as being up until 40 days as being mere water. And there are ancient Jewish texts that describe a pregnancy as being a part of the mother's thigh. The Jewish text understands that pregnancy is a part of the mother's body up until the point of birth. And all of this is to say that in the Jewish tradition, abortion is permitted and sometimes required if the life of a mother is threatened. I want to say that again because it's really important. In the Jewish tradition, abortion is permitted and sometimes required if the life of the person experiencing pregnancy is threatened. So the reason that for me, this is a separation of church and state issue is quite simply that if a law limits access to abortion, a law limits the access of a Jewish person to make the decision that their religious tradition commands. And so the laws that we see, for instance, in Texas, for me, I can understand in this First Amendment separation of church and state way, because that would mean that my wife and I were very lucky to welcome 3 beautiful young women into this world, and one of those pregnancies with our twins was quite perilous, and there were moments where we had to have conversations around like early in pregnancy around what that would mean for my wife and for us as a family. And our understanding of our religious tradition permitted those conversations, and those conversations were happening before SB 8 went into effect, but those conversations would be largely illegal to have, or not to have, but to actualize in the state of Texas at this moment. The other thing that I want to say that's related to this is it's really clear from, I hope, from the text that I just shared with you, that Jewish tradition does not understand life beginning at any point until birth. And a lot of the conversations about abortion specifically and reproductive justice more broadly and reproductive freedom touch on the question of when life begins. And when life begins is a deeply and exclusively religious question. And different religious traditions have different answers to that question. It is a philosophical conversation about what is life and when does it start and when does it end. Those are valuable, important religious conversations that I think that many of the people in this Zoom might come to different, deeply held faithful beliefs about. And so an attempt to legislate legally a definition of when life begins is an attempt to legislate a religious question into our civil law. And we see this like, and sometimes those attempts use a pseudoscientific arbitrary point to try and say, well, we can all agree that this moment is when life begins, when in actuality we cannot all agree. And the Texas abortion ban is an excellent example, this so-called fetal heartbeat bill, which says that like the moment that something resembling a heartbeat can be detected, though the thing does not yet have a heart in the way that you and I might understand what heart means, then according to Texas civil law at the moment, it is a human being with co-equal rights. But that is an attempt to assign a scientific fact to a religious understanding in order to legislate that in civil law. And that is deeply concerning to me because, like I said, my religion loves pregnancy. The very first commandment in the Bible is be fruitful and multiply. We want people to have welcome, beloved pregnancies. And we do not understand what is happening during that pregnancy as life in the same sense as afterbirth. And that is a religious conviction. And I will say, just to sort of wrap all of this up, that my understanding of the First Amendment and the separation of church and state clause is that it is about trying to protect minority views from the majority's practice. It is about trying to protect religious minorities. I come from a relatively small religious community, from having the faith traditions or beliefs of the majority imposed upon them. And what is concerning and fascinating to me about this debate, and fascinating in a sort of morbid way, is that what seems to be happening is a flipping of the First Amendment, such that now it is being used to protect the majority from minorities. That my belief, which the belief that life begins at birth may not be the majority view in America, but it is certainly a deeply held religious view by at least some percentage of Americans, is now being legislated against as a means to protect a particular Christian understanding. Not that all Christians share that understanding, but that is what is trying to be legislated. And so as a member of a minority community, that's deeply concerning to me. I want to say one other thing really quickly, because I know my time is almost up. And I actually wrote this out because I wanted to be sure I was saying it clearly. But and I'm happy to go deeper into this during the Q&A if people are interested. But I've been reading and thinking a lot lately about the framework of bodily autonomy as it relates to abortion and reproductive freedom. And it has revealed to me a limitation in the position I just presented that I think is worth naming. When I explained that the traditional Jewish understanding of abortion a minute ago is that it is permissible or perhaps even required to have an abortion to save the life of the mother, that is not at its essence a position that centers bodily autonomy of the person who's pregnant. That still puts someone else in the position of authority to determine what is or is not an acceptable justification for that person to have an abortion. And here we're still subjecting abortion to a coercive and patriarchal framework. So I think that framing the reproductive choice conversation in terms of protections of the First Amendment for Jewish people whose tradition permits abortion is useful, but it's limited because it also means that we are working within a still oppressive framework. And I am seeking new models for understanding this issue that do not deny the autonomy and full humanity of people who experience pregnancy. I think that the truly non-coercive framework is one of bodily autonomy. I believe that every person is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And one of the things this means is that we are empowered by God as moral decision makers. God does not and cannot coerce the decisions we make about our bodies. And I believe that God does not support systems, either religious or civil, that seek to coerce bodies either. To be pregnant is one of the greatest acts of imitating God, perhaps the closest to the divine that one can get. And I believe that God cannot and will not coerce someone into that sacred act. So in spaces like this, where we can have loving and frank conversations about the great power of our traditions and their limitations, I want to put forward these kinds of theologies of choice as the ones that should be protected by the First Amendment. Here, I think the Jewish text that describes a pregnancy as part of the mother's thigh is even more useful than the Exodus text I shared with you, because here it is very clear that the Jewish tradition understands the pregnancy as part of the mother's body. And so I just want to say that I'm aware of the usefulness in our civic conversation of the things I said, and I am aware of their limitations, and happy to engage with that more as we get into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Fixler. If anyone has questions for Rabbi or wants to know more about the connection between reproductive freedom and religious freedom, please feel free to put those questions in the chat. In the meanwhile, we're going to move on to our next topic for the night, LGBTQ rights. Americans United believes that everyone should be able to live openly without fear of discrimination. We should all be able to live and love as we see fit. But for the LGBTQ community, that right has never been a given, as religious extremists and their lawmaker allies have sought and continue to seek to block LGBTQ rights from progressing. Americans United has pushed for protection of LGBTQ rights in the courts and in the legislatures. We've supported the Federal Equality Act, which would prohibit discrimination against LGBTQ individuals, as well as the Do No Harm Act, which would prevent groups and individuals from misusing religious freedom and religious exemptions as a weapon to discriminate against LGBTQ individuals and others. Meanwhile, in the courts, we're pushing back against efforts by government-funded religious foster care agencies to turn away LGBTQ folks and others who practice, as they see it, the wrong religion from being able to foster children. We represent an Indiana guidance counselor who was fired by her Catholic school because she's married to another woman. And we have continued to file briefs across the country supporting states' non-discrimination laws. Here to speak with us more about the connection between LGBTQ rights and religious freedom is Brandon Mack. Brandon Mack is Interim Director of Operations for the International Association for College Admission Counseling, the nonprofit that supports counselors, advisors, and others who work with international students to help them in their pursuit of higher education opportunities. Additionally, he's a community activist and sociologist dedicated to issues relating to the intersections of race, gender, and sexual orientation. He's a lead organizer with Black Lives Matter Houston. He's screening committee chair of the Houston LGBTQ+ political caucus and research coordinator for the mayor's LGBTQ advisory board. He's well known for his research on effemophobia, negativity related to effeminate gay men. And he's currently a PhD student at the Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies program at the University of Houston. So you are looking at the future Dr. Mack. Thank you so much, Brandon Mack, for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit more about the links you see between church-state separation and LGBTQ rights?
Absolutely. So thank you, Adrienne. Thank you to Nancy, Keith, and everyone with Americans United for Separation of Church and State in the Greater Houston chapter. And good evening to everyone. Once again, my name is Brandon Mack, pronouns he, him, his, and I am a Black, queer, cisgender man from Houston, Texas. So I have been an activist for the past 15 years, and I am unapologetically all of my intersections. And it didn't start out that way. And it hasn't been easy to be able to develop that because we live in a world that deals with a fundamental problem of devaluing human life. And many times growing up, I was told that I could not be all of myself. I was told that being Black somehow devalued my maleness. Being Black somehow devalued my queerness, and that being Black meant that I was less than here in the United States of America. The same goes with my queerness. Somehow my queerness was less than because of me being Black, and because that I am queer, I am therefore less than a man or perceived man. So all those things and all those messages were actually told to me initially in one place, the church. So to me, separation of church and state is a very, very personal issue because I've had to deal with it my entire life. With being told that because of inherently who I am somehow less of a person. And religious doctrine was used to reinforce that message. So I grew up Southern Missionary Baptist. As I mentioned, I was often teased and heard disparaging and damaging remarks related to myself coming directly from the pulpit. My father is a deacon, and I actually came out in a church service during Easter Sunday. So picture it is Easter Sunday. I have come home to go to Easter Sunday service with my family, and I am wearing a wonderful form-fitting suit. I looked very, very cute, if I say so myself. But unfortunately, my father did not agree with my style of dress because he felt that men do not dress the way that I was dressing. I was trying to vehemently not change my clothes and change who I am, but I ended up doing so because my sister and my stepmom begged me profusely in order to do so. So I did change my clothes. So then we go on to church. In the midst of going through that entire church service, I'm just trying to get there, be there, get out. We go all the way through till we get to the end of the service, the wonderful benediction. Everyone gets up. My dad and my stepmom go to the back of the church because they're in the finance room counting up the offering. And in the midst of that, the minister gets up and he says, I want to do a special shout out to our college students. I don't want to name any names specifically because I don't want you to think that minister forgot about you, but Brother Mac. So I'm like, okay, so this man's going to call me out in the middle of church. Okay. Hey, minister, how you doing? We ain't seen you in a while. Yeah, I've been busy, with school, things of that nature. And then he says the following: I hear you're getting married. Now, if you know a good old Southern Baptist church, all of a sudden you're hearing woos and all this other kind of stuff. I said, without skipping a beat, no, I'm not getting married. It's not legal in this state yet. Hush. Now, immediately, some people I could tell got it, but some people did not get it. So for a little emphasis, I decided to say, and for those of you who don't understand, you'll understand by the time you get home. Needless to say, it got all the way to the back of the church before I got out to my father that this is what happened. And I had to make it very, very clear to him. I may change my clothes, but I don't change who I am. Who I am is all of who I am. And this building, this space, no one gets to dictate who I am, where I go, and how I can be and breathe in this world. So to me, it goes back once again to a very fundamental thing, that church doctrine has been used to devalue human life. It has been used to justify who has rights, who doesn't have rights, who can be in spaces, who can't be in certain spaces, and we have got to address that. And one of the ways that we address that is the separation of church and state. You can believe whatever you want to be. You can go to any house of worship that you want to go to. However, it should not be weaponized and used within governmental and state actions to dictate the rights, privileges, and values of our society. Because it is not universal what everyone believes, and one belief should not supersede. But one thing that is universal is we're all human beings. And therefore, as human beings, we should all have the right to be and breathe. But unfortunately, we have seen this devaluation of human life being used with religious doctrine since the beginning of us as a country. Let's go back to the fact that even though those founding fathers created the separation of church and state, there truly wasn't a separation of church and state, especially when it comes to marginalized bodies and marginalized people. We have to remember that religious doctrine was used to justify the institution of slavery. Many of those lawmakers who enshrined the separation of church and state also believed in religious doctrines that justified the enslavement of Black people. So inherently, we haven't always had a separation of church and state. And it has definitely been used and weaponized specifically when it comes to marginalized people, and that is Black people, different races of people, but especially LGBTQ plus people. And according to the Association of American Medical Colleges, since 2015, state lawmakers across the entire United States have introduced over 175 anti-LGBTQ plus bills into legislation. These include repeals on local non-discrimination laws, allowing religious people and organizations to refuse to provide services and goods to LGBTQ plus people, and preventing transgender people from accessing restroom facilities based on their gender identity, and even keeping our kids from playing sports that correspond to their gender identity. Even some of these so-called religious exemption bills prevent access to healthcare for LGBTQ plus people, thereby exacerbating anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination in healthcare and increasing LGBTQ plus health disparities. So it's interesting that a group community that suggests love thy neighbor is using religious doctrine to justify hurt against their neighbor. And we can no longer be a party to that. It's so bad that we even had a representative here in the state of Texas named State Representative Brian Slayton, who's a Republican from outside of Dallas. Just yesterday, he announced that he is planning to file legislation that would prevent kids from attending a drag show. If you don't want to go to the show, don't go to the show. But don't prevent everyone else from being able to be, breathe, celebrate, be their full authentic selves. Because my authentic self does not prevent you from being your authentic self. But the use and the weaponization of legislation against specific people has got to stop. And one way that we stop that is by ensuring that there is that separation of church and state. We have got to make sure that we are challenging elected officials who bring that in by literally telling them to stop. We have got to make sure that we are voting in every single election, up and down the ballot. Because trust me, the further down you get, the closer you get to yourself. And so even for our county officials, city officials, local officials, we have got to make sure that if they are suggesting religious doctrine as being the justification for their actions, that has got to stop, especially if it is doing harm to marginalized people. So the church has always been a weapon for dehumanization. That is why we have to have the separation for church and state. It should have no place in our government because based off of some religions, I'm not a person because I'm Black. I'm not a person because I am queer. And that is the same for our bisexual, transgender, pansexual, and other people who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community. Now, this month is Pride Month, where we celebrate the beautifulness of the LGBTQ plus community. And generally, we give you life. Now, if we give you life, that means you need to care about ours. So one last thing that I want to say, because I know my time is wrapping up, is the following. The time for allyship is over. We can no longer just be merely allies to each other, because allies get the ability to step in and out of the fight. What we need are accomplices. We need people who have a deeper connection, who feel the same sense of loss, even if it doesn't directly impact them. Because my Black life matters, my LGBTQ plus life matters, and if I care, and if you care about me, then I should matter to you. And so we all need to be accomplices to one another and speak up and speak out on behalf of all of us to secure the rights for all of us. Because when they come for one, it is not too long before they come for every single one of you. So in the spirit of Pride Month, I ask all of us to become accomplices, to ensure that that separation of church and state is a strong separation. Because for too terribly long, we have devalued each other, and religious doctrine has been that tool that has led to our devaluation. And we can no longer do that, because my humanity, your humanity, and the humanity of every single person in the LGBTQ plus community is not up for debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions for Brandon Mack on religious freedom, promoting LGBTQ plus rights, racial justice, and becoming an accomplice, please do put those in the Q&A box. In the meantime, that provides the perfect transition to our final topic for the night, racial justice. Religious extremists seeking to force their views on everyone else don't just threaten areas like reproductive freedom and LGBTQ rights. As we just heard, they also pose a serious threat to the push for racial justice. Looking around our country today, we see a push for state money to go to private school vouchers, attacking our public education system. We see parents claiming that schools educating their children about the realities of slavery and racism in this country, both in the past and today, violates their religious beliefs. We see white Christian nationalists storming the Capitol and seeking to overturn elections, fighting democracy itself. And while religious groups have been more upfront about seeking exemptions from laws prohibiting sexual orientation discrimination or laws protecting people's reproductive freedom, they use these same arguments to try to get out of accountability for racism too. And indeed, Americans United just got a major win today, with a federal appellate court ruling that we can move forward with a lawsuit brought on behalf of Greg Tucker, former teacher and director of student life at a religious school in Colorado. At that school, there was rampant racism, with white students using slurs and harassing students of color. Our client, Greg, held a symposium to try to educate the students on racism and the importance of fighting against it. But after parents of some of the worst offenders complained to the school, he was fired. The school is trying to argue that Greg was a minister of the faith at the school and trying to use this as a way to get out of liability. They've argued that courts have to essentially rubber stamp their assertions that Greg was a minister and that they can't be held accountable for the racism that they have fostered and promoted. Their approach would have the potential to thwart employees' civil rights across the country. Luckily, the federal appellate court didn't buy their arguments, and we're going to be able to move forward with that lawsuit with an opportunity to get justice for Greg and for all the students affected. But this just goes to show the importance of promoting separation of church and state to promote racial justice. Here to talk with us more about the connection between racial justice and religious freedom is Bishop John Ogletree Jr., or Bishop O. He's the founding pastor of First Metropolitan Baptist Church. He's pastored the congregation there since 1986 and was consecrated as bishop in November 2021. Bishop O serves on the executive committee of the NAACP of Houston, and he has served in many roles in the Baptist General Convention of Texas. He also previously served 17 years as board trustee for the Cypress Fairbanks Independent School District and was recognized as one of 75 individuals or groups who contributed significantly to shaping the school district during its 75th anniversary celebration. But despite his noted contributions to the school district, he was recently pushed out of the board along with two of his colleagues due to an organized campaign by white Christian nationalists to take control of the board. Bishop Ogletree, would you be able to tell us more about the connections you see between racial justice and church-state separation?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It has been a very interesting discussion, very enlightening tonight. Of course, I have been and the justice move for it seems like all of my life, seeking justice, fighting for justice. And it is a part of my faith. I believe that the biblical scriptures call for justice. In fact, God had stated in what I read in the scriptures that he promotes justice. He is for justice. Justice and righteousness are a part of his own foundation, his own throne. You can't have righteousness without justice. The shame of today is this Christian nationalism that would put justice, a word before it, and they have made it an anathema. They put the word social before justice. And so any effort to look at the history of the wrongs that have been committed against Black, Brown, Asian, Native Americans is seen now as critical race theory. And they do not want to look at the history. They do not want to admit that in this great country of ours, that there is still injustice. I lost my election in November because my opponents espoused the belief that we were involved in pushing forth critical race theory. If we talked about inclusion, that was critical race theory. If we talked about diversity, that was critical race theory. If we talked about equity, trying to right the wrongs, even in education, to make those who have been neglected and left behind, to make them whole, and to put them on a pathway for opportunity, that was seen as critical race theory. The shame of today is that those nationalists would deny the history of the nation. And we need to study our history. We need to know the history. Our children need to know the history, to know what has happened, so that those things will not be repeated. I think in a marriage, to look at what is wrong in a marriage, to discuss, for a husband and wife to discuss what has gone wrong, is not to say that you don't love each other, you don't love the marriage. It is to look at what has transpired and that what you don't want to happen again. And so this fight for justice must continue. As an African-American man, I still give my grown sons the talk. When they visit me, when they leave my house, drive the speed limit or haul your lights on. If you get stopped, don't talk back to a police officer. We're in 2022. When will the talk cease? It shouldn't have to be that we are still watching unarmed Black, brown, male, female people killed by police. And to say that they do it does not mean I do not promote good law enforcement. It means that there is a problem with justice in America. When we look at sentencing when we see the disparagement, the gap between African American person and an white person, same background, same offense, the African American person gets a higher sentence. Someone should be disturbed by that. We should not have to go through that. Racial profiling, we should not have to experience that. And in our schools, in our public schools, all of the studies show that African Americans will be at a lower percentage in a public school, but a higher percentage, most of the times, double that of white students or more when it comes to discipline and removing them out of the classroom setting. And these nationalists have come in and, in the name of God, declaring that all of that is critical race theory. And they try to quote Martin Luther King Jr. They come before school board meetings, their publications will try to quote the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, he dreams of a day that one day when his children would not be judged by the content, by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. They take that out of context and try to say that if we talk about history, and if we talk about slavery, and if we talk about the Black codes, if we talk about redlining, if we talk about gerrymandering, if we talk about the African-American soldiers who fought in World War II, who were denied the benefits of the GI Bill, if we talk about Jim Crow South, they say that that's making them feel guilty, making their children feel guilty. And that Martin Luther King says that we shouldn't judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Well, we are dealing with character. Whenever there is bias, whenever there is injustice, whenever there is implicit bias, whenever there are gaps in the socio-economic status and ladder, whenever there is prejudice, whenever there is discrimination, that deals with character. And the character of the country should be what the Declaration of Independence said, that we believe that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. And among them are the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The fight for justice, I thought we would be much further ahead, but these nationalists who wrap the Bible, as Rick Warren says, wrap the Bible in an American flag, have forsaken justice. Jesus the Christ in Matthew chapter 23 told the Pharisees, who were trying to keep every tenor of the law, that they should continue to keep it, but they had neglected something which was far more weightier. And what they had neglected was justice. And what is happening in America today with these white nationalists and white supremacists is a neglect of justice. And it is a shame that the same people who would claim Jesus the Christ as their Lord and Savior would not love their neighbor, would not promote fairness, and would not put forth justice ahead of all these programs. Justice must reign, and I'm going to stay on the battlefield and fight for it as long as I can.
We are incredibly grateful to have you fighting on that battlefield. And thank you so much, Bishop O, for coming to speak with us. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. And thank you as well to all our supporters listening in. AU couldn't do the work we do to protect church-state separation without your support. Now we'll be moving on to the Q&A portion of the evening. So if you have questions that have come up during the discussion, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Adrienne. And that was fascinating. And we do have some questions for each of you. Let me go backwards and start with Bishop Ogletree. I've got a couple of questions for you, but first let me ask you, could you tell us a little bit more about the school board campaign? I know that you were called a racist, and I know from what I've read that the campaign against you and your school board colleagues was organized by people who are white Christian nationalists. Could you tell us a little bit more about that campaign and their efforts?
Yes, thank you. During the campaign, they went on my social media post and saw that I had criticized white evangelicals of their support for Donald Trump and for what happened on January 6th. They also saw that I had posted articles that promoted justice down through the years. And I would promote articles from the Atlantic magazine or from the Chronicle, anything that promoted justice, that talked about the need for justice in America. They turned that around and said I was a racist. They created a website, ogletreeisaRacist.com, and they took every thing that I posted and twisted it around, and that's the tactic they used against me.
You have been in this fight, Bishop. I'm going to stick with you for just another couple of minutes. You have been in this fight for a long time. Do you see a difference between what's known today as white Christian nationalists and what was known in the past as just racist?
This racism is camouflaged now in this political ideology. Racism is now, all of them will deny they are racist. But it's the effect of what you do. It's what you do. And they are doing the same things that was done to Black and brown people in the 50s and 60s in the South. And so the difference is they deny that they are racist, but their behavior and what they do, it still equates to the same thing.
And then one more question. A lot of viewers probably know or have heard about the justification. In fact, y'all mentioned it, the justification some people used to use for slavery. Brandon mentioned it, for slavery based on Christianity or the Bible or whatever. But people might not know about how vouchers are tied to racism. So can you explain a little bit about that, how vouchers is a church-state separation issue?
Thank you. Thank you. The unexpressed motivation of vouchers is to destroy public schools. The shift in the last few decades has been in our public schools, the demographic shift has been Black and brown students. And without saying it, these conservatives have decided they don't want their tax money, their hard-earned tax money, being used to educate them. What is happening with charter schools and with this voucher issue is a resegregation. That's the effort to resegregate the schools. Get a certain number of students, the elite students, the white students, get them out and destroy the public school system, defund them. And that's the effort. They won't come out and say it. But if you track when the demographic shift took place, you can also find that that's when this harder push toward vouchers as well as charter schools.
Thank you. And thank you for asking the question that answering the question that I meant to ask, not I think the question that I asked. I did want you to talk about the connection between vouchers and racism, and you did address that. Rabbi Fixler, I want to turn to you now. I want to ask a little bit about your activism. How long you've been in activism on this particular topic, how your activism has evolved, and if you've seen how you're received, and if you've seen a difference in how your presentations are received, either recently. I don't know how much activism you've been able to do recently, but of course, this topic is now really back in the news with the Supreme Court decision coming out any day now. But how your presentation and your argument has perceived. I'm going to ask you in a minute how it's been perceived by some of the elected officials that represent us. But I'm just curious for now how it's been perceived by some of the people like us that you speak with or speak to.
Yeah, it's absolutely. So as I said, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm a third generation person sort of in this movement. I was really lucky. I did some reproductive justice and feminist activism in college, and then my first job out of college was for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which is an interfaith pro-choice organization that grew out of an organization called the Clergy Consultation Service, which was a underground railroad of Jewish and Christian clergy predominantly that helped in the era before Roe people seeking abortion to get those services. And so I was really honored to work with them doing youth organizing. Now I'm honored to be back on the board. And one of the people who I helped train when she was doing youth organizing is now the president of RCRC. So that's really fun. So I've been in it a long time. I will say that the political reality that we are about to presumably enter was one that when I started doing this work seemed like the kind of scary story you would tell your children to scare them at night, but not a thing that it's something we knew could happen slowly over time, but not something that we knew would happen this abruptly. But I will say that part of why it's been an honor to do this work through the Religious Coalition is that the ability to say the sentence, people are pro-choice because of their faith, not in spite of it. People support the right to access abortion care and reproductive justice broadly because of their faith and not in spite of it, is really important. And what I have found in the 15 years that I've been doing this work is that voice is really necessary in these conversations, and particularly reframing this away from privacy. The whole debate that's happening in the Supreme Court now is about whether Roe v. Wade was rightly decided about privacy. But if we can reframe it not as an issue of privacy, but as an issue of religious freedom, which for me, as I explained it, fundamentally is, we have the opportunity, I think, to create much broader consensus. Not that there isn't broad consensus now that abortion should be legal in at least some cases. The majority of Americans think that, which speaks to the attempts by the religious right and white nationalists to control this issue despite the will of the American people.
Well, Rabbi, you've made it very clear to us watching you and listening to you tonight that abortion, the question of abortion, when life begins, contraception, those sorts of issues are a matter of religious freedom. And you've talked about how Jewish traditions differ from those that are enshrined in the latest Texas abortion law, and some of the ones that they're talking about enacting during the next session. But I wanted to know, have you had the opportunity to present those arguments to some of our legislators? And if so, how have they responded?
Yeah, I have done lobbying at various times, both in my previous professional life and now as a rabbi, on this and other social justice issues. And I think, similarly to what I said before, presenting this idea that people of faith are not a monolith, just the sort of what shouldn't be surprising but seems to be surprising idea that that people of faith are strongly and deeply committed to reproductive choice, rights, and justice, can be really eye-opening. The challenge, I will say, that living in Houston is that that is not a tough sell to a lot of our elected officials in at least the places that I have lived, and the people who it is a tougher sell for are the ones who I am not their constituents. But I also want to say, because I don't want to be all doom and gloom, I want to say a little piece of what I think is opportunity. When I worked for the Religious Coalition all those years ago, a lot of the work we were doing at the time was about comprehensive sex education and trying to pass federal policy that was about making sure that the education that people were receiving about their bodies was accurate and affirming and age appropriate. And one of the things I learned there, and this was when I lived in Washington, D.C., was that textbook companies cannot afford to design different textbooks for different parts of the country or for different states. It's just not how the business works. And so they write textbooks for the biggest states and then sell them everywhere. And of course, the biggest market for textbooks in the entire country is the state in which I now live, is Texas. And so what we learned is that policies in Texas that determined what people could teach, whether it was how they could teach about LGBTQ folks, whether it was how they could teach about race, whether it was how they could teach about sex and sexuality, all of that, what is determined here has the potential to have a chilling effect all over the country because the textbooks get written for here, but it also has the potential to be transformative around the country. The reason things like the Don't Say Gay bill exist in Florida is because they know that that's another big textbook market, amongst other things. And so one of the things that I try and hold on to now, having moved to Texas, a place that my Washington, D.C. self wouldn't have thought would happen. The thing that I try to hold on to now is that we have incredible power when we are talking to our elected officials, when we are making these cases around separation of church and state and justice, and particularly around the way those impact education, as Bishop Ogletree spoke about so beautifully, to make a difference, not just on what happens here, but really to set a standard for what can happen around the country. That wasn't totally an answer to your question, but I was excited to say.
It was a good answer, nonetheless. Now, Brandon, I really only have one question for you, and that is, when will you be ready to assume the presidency of the Houston chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State?
That's very kind of you, Nancy. I would have to unfortunately free up a couple more things off my plate in order to be able to tackle that on. But I think this is an amazing organization, one that is doing very, very important work and is also activating people because, as the rabbi and as the bishop also mentioned, every single one of us takes part in this. And it could be as simple as your vote, but it could also be you raising your voice in every single level of government and letting them know that this is not okay and challenging these systems, because it is going to literally take every single one of us to be active to really make that fundamental change.
Right. I seriously, I have two more questions, and any one of you can answer this. Adrienne, it may be most appropriate for you because, after all, as a lawyer for AU, this is what you, and AU focuses on every day. AU is the only organization in this country that focuses 100% of its time and resources on church-state separation, advocating for it. But there's something that we really should have defined probably at the beginning of this evening instead of at the end, and that is white Christian nationalism. Any of you can address this, but one of our audience members has asked if we could define that. So any of you who wants to do it, would you please just jump in? Well,
Well, I'll at least go ahead and attempt to take a stab at it. So if you think about white nationalism in terms of that as being white individuals who are trying to enforce and use systems to reinforce that white is superior to every single other race, it's in the same vein when you think of white Christian nationalism. Instead, that these are white individuals who are asserting that the Christian religion and the Christian perspective should supersede any and all other religious ideologies and other beliefs. So when we are talking about that, we are literally talking about individuals who want to make it that the white Christian perspective is the only perspective that you are considering and the one that you're being attentive to.
And
I'll add, it also includes the idea that it is the white man who made America, and that God was behind that. And God has a special place in heaven for America, and that they connect what has happened in this country to their hands and to their minds, and that is, and God has endorsed it and backed it all, and that's why America is exceptional.
And I'll just add to that, I'm going to read briefly a definition or description that's on AU National's website. And it says, white Christian nationalism is the dangerous belief that America is and must remain a Christian nation founded for its white Christian inhabitants, and that our laws and policies must reflect this premise. Denying the separation of church and state promised by our Constitution, white Christian nationalists oppose equality for people of color, women, LGBTQ people, religious minorities, and the non-religious. Now, I'd like to wrap this up now. We're about to run out of time, and it's always good to wrap up on a good note, or a note of hope, or a note of activism, or a note of advice. So I'd like to ask each of you, if you would, to just sort of maybe give some final remarks, final bit of hope, final bit of advice to us. Brandon, you've done such a great job of doing that. I don't know if you have anything left to say, but let me start with you, in case you do.
Much appreciated. But yeah, just wanting to once again re-emphasize to every single one of us that we can no longer just be mere allies. We've got to have stronger connections. We have got to have stronger involvement, because they are literally coming for every single one of us. So please get involved in any way that you can, that you feel is best. But as long as you are making sure that people are being protected and not harmed, you're doing the right thing.
Thank you. Rabbi Fixler?
I will. I'll say this by way of my conclusion. Jewish people love to throw around this Hebrew phrase "tikkun olam," which means to repair the world. If you have heard one Hebrew phrase in a space like this, it is probably that one. And it is an important Jewish value, but I think it is sometimes misunderstood. It comes from this ancient mystical idea that says that the universe was created in light, and the light was so bright and so divine and so holy that it shattered everything. And that light went and sprinkled itself throughout creation and hides itself in various people and places. And when we are engaged in acts of tikkun olam, in acts of repair of the world, we are in the act of seeking out those shards of divine light and bringing them together so that they glow more brightly. And all of that is to say that that our work is to acknowledge brokenness, to acknowledge that the world exists in a state of becoming and a state of possibility and a state in need of repair. To acknowledge that our work is to build a more perfect union, because we're never going to have a perfect union. to acknowledge that our nation, like our world, is in need of acknowledgement of that brokenness, and all of us to bring the shard of light that exists in us together into a brighter and more divine light that is more affirming and more loving and more protective of the people whose lights too often get snuffed out. And so I'm really honored to be in this work with you, this work that I really do believe is world repair. And I'm honored to be in this work with you, because when I get to see all of you and hear your stories, I know that there's a lot of light here that we can bring to the world.
Bishop Ogletree, I'm not sure if we've lost you or not. If you're still there, we wanted to offer you the opportunity to give advice, words of wisdom, whatever you'd like to say at the end.
I'm here. Thank you. What I would close with is what the scriptures say, and it is 3 words: God is love. And I believe that love is the answer to every ill. Love is the answer to injustice. Love is the answer to hatred and discrimination. Love is the answer to economic disparity. When I was coming up, Diana Ross sang a song, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." It's the only thing that there's just too little of. We need to love.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that advice from all of you. We're going to love, we're going to do justice, and we're going to vote. And maybe together we can change the world. I want to thank all of you so much for this incredible program. Thank you, of course, for giving your time, but thank you for your remarks. As I said at the beginning, this is going to be recorded. And I know I, for one, I'm going to watch it again. I heard a lot tonight that I'd like to be able to hear again. I appreciate also Adrian for joining us tonight. It's always good for us who are out here in the grassroots, or the hinterlands, I guess I could say, to have the opportunity to see one of the national organization's wonderful staff members. We appreciate the work that you do, especially the lawyers who are out there trying to fight for us in the courts. And now finally, to all of you who have joined us, I thank you. Those of you who are members, I thank you for your support. Those of you who haven't had a chance to join yet, of course, I have to ask that you consider doing so. I can't make a better case than Brandon Mack did, so I won't even try, but we really would appreciate your support. I'd like to show one more time of different ways that you all can become involved with us and become involved with the national organization. And that is, stay informed, sign up for our chapter's emails, follow us on social media, sign up for the Nationals emails so you can stay informed about what we're doing locally and what the national organization is doing. Help inform and educate others. Share what you hear. If you are invited to a program, or you see a program that sounds interesting, invite your friends. Share social media posts. Share the information so others will learn about what's going on, because it's going to take all of us. And what else are we going to have to do? Advocate. Vote yes, but also advocate. Speak to your elected officials, whether you think they're sympathetic or not. You may say, oh, they're sympathetic to me, I don't need to spend my time on it. Or you may say just the opposite. No, they represent us. They need to hear from all of us. And it doesn't take long. You don't have to speak to them. I can guarantee they won't answer the phone. It doesn't take long for you just to send an email or make a phone call to their office to let them know how you feel, because they are elected to represent you. Connect with your local chapter. We'd love you to come to one of our board meetings. Every month we put the next board meeting in our monthly newsletter. We also put it on our website. We would love for you to join us. If you don't want to come or you don't have the time, let us know what you would like to see us do. We welcome suggestions from our board members for activities, for programs, anything. And of course, if you have a special skill or want to learn something new, or just want to get involved with us with the cause, please reach out to us. We would love to have you involved with what we're doing with our chapter and with the national organization. And finally, as I mentioned, renew if you're already a member, and you do that by going to the national website. And if you haven't had a chance to join, if you're in our area, you can join through our Houston chapter's website, auhouston.org. And if you're from somewhere else in the country, you can go to the national website to see if there's a chapter near you, or to join through the national website. And if you do join through the national website, any of you, we encourage you to be sure to tell them when you join that you want to be associated with the chapter that's near you. So once again, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. But the most important thing you can do tonight is share this program with other people. Tell them what a great program it was. Send them the link. Send them our website once we send it out to you, or tell them about our organization, because it's only through strength, through adding our voices together, our votes and our voices and our actions, that we can make a difference and that we can preserve the separation of church and state that allows us to have freedom without favor and equality without exception. Thank you. Good night.